Hello and welcome to Banjo Strings and Drinking Gourds, the podcast of the American Frontier Culture Museum. I'm Alex.
And I'm Rachel.
And today we are going to do something a bit different than usual. I am going to interview my co-presenter, Rachel. As you can guess by listening to this podcast, Rachel is an archaeologist. She has a PhD in archaeology from the University of Sheffield. Rachel has worked on digs in Israel, Texas, Colorado, and England. And my first question for Rachel is a simple one. What is archaeology?
Archaeology is the study of the material culture left behind by past people. So essentially, it's the entire contextual study of past lifeways. What people were using, how they were making things, how they were using those things, and how they're getting deposited in the archaeological record, which basically means what are they doing with these items that we can find to actually have them end up where they do in the ground.
All right, so the question is, after hearing that, is why is this important?
It's always important to study the past and study past lifeways because it gives us a broader understanding of how we ended up where we are, how the modern world is working, because it is built on the foundation that the people we are looking at through their items have laid for us. And it's kind of a cliche at this point, but it is important that, history repeats itself. We have to understand how people in the past faced very similar circumstances to things that crop up, like pandemics or like warfare and interpersonal conflicts. Human nature doesn't change, just the tools that we have to deal with the conflicts of human nature change. So it's interesting to look at how people used to deal with things and what items they had and how those things are being used, and then also building off of, well, this is very similar. We still cook the same. We still apply heat to meat. We still apply heat to water to make our food. So the basics haven't changed, just some of the application of technologies.
Right. And the question I have is, how do you become an archaeologist? I've watched a lot of Indiana Jones movies. I have a fedora hat. I've seen Time Team. Does that make me an archaeologist, or is there a little bit more to it?
Now, the time team aspect, that's not too bad. But being an archaeologist, you have a couple different pathways. You can go the standard, going to college, going to field school, possibly a graduate degree, and then going into either the academic side, the research side, or the CRM or cultural resource management side, which is the more commercial aspect of a lot of mitigation archaeology, which is getting ahead of doing digs and excavations ahead of construction and new builds. You can also just go straight into becoming what is affectionately known as a shovel monkey, or volunteering on digs, learning through doing. So there is a pathway of not going to school, not getting some of the theory and method, and simply doing excavation. Neither route is necessarily better. Just by going the CRM route, the commercial or seasonal excavation route, it's kind of like on-the-job training. You'll pick up the scientific aspects typically covered in a 2 or 4 year degree, things like sedimentation, stratigraphy, taphonomic processes, the science that explains what happened to these artifacts as they entered the record, as they were deposited and remained behind, or not, as the case may be. Not one way or the other is better per se. It really is a function of how much time and money you want to invest on essentially being prepared for a career, or if you can gain a job and pick up things as you go, or even your career goals. There's definitely a need for a broader knowledge base within your area of specialty if you ever want to teach, and traditionally at least one degree has been the route to an academic career. It is possible to be an academic after a career in the field because you're actually there seeing the archaeological record, physically touching it, which adds a sense and understanding up to the story the artifacts are telling. That is pretty much absent in simply reading or studying from pictures. It's why typically a 4 year degree requires a field school. There's something almost surreal about holding a piece of the past that you've pulled out of the dirt where somebody's past actions put it. And that's why, no matter what route you take, why there will always be a need for archaeologists.
I've heard that archaeology is really a hard thing to study because it pulls from so many various different sources. What are some of the most common ones you're pulling from?
So archaeology is definitely an interdisciplinary area of study because it's not simply the physical labor of going out and digging. It's also using historic records, so knowing how to research, knowing how to access primary sources. A lot of diaries will tell you what happened to a specific person at a specific site that you might be excavating. And this is historic archaeology, of course. Prehistoric archaeology has its own challenges. But you're also using geology. You have to know how the soil is forming, what types of soil will preserve certain types of artifacts. You have to really understand basic cartography. You have to know how to read maps, especially as cartography improves. Historic maps don't reflect modern landscape all the time. You have to be able to compare the two. You have to know how to use a lot of, let's say, advanced technologies. You have to understand some of the, what is GIS? What is GPR? You have to understand how, looking at ground penetrating radar, what is the result they're actually giving you? So you're actually using a lot of imaging skills as well, which usually develop more in the harder sciences. And this is why archaeology is very hard to classify. A lot of times schools will, especially universities, will lump archaeology into the humanities because it is the study of man via their goods, but it's not a soft science, which is an extremely derogatory term. It's a very complex and diverse discipline that really pulls a lot of aspects from other disciplines into itself, and also works with other disciplines as well, particularly if you get into, say, marine archaeology. You have to know, okay, well, how are marine organisms going to affect your artifacts? That pulls in marine biology. You have to understand oceanography, you have to understand currents, things like that. So it's really going to be, archaeology relies on knowledge from many, many sources and from many different disciplines.
Right. That seems quite a challenge to become an archaeologist. One of the things that is always curious to me is when they find bones or bodies of humans and they're able to date them and they're able to figure out what their last meal was. How does this happen?
So a lot of the dating, first of all, you're going to look for clues. How were they buried? Is there any sort of specific orientation? An isolated burial is not going to give you too much to go on. It could be happenstance that a particular one single isolated burial is buried facing a specific way. But you've got, the Christian burials where they're facing very specific ways. And if you've got a cemetery or multiple graves, you can figure out the patterning, and that can help date. Also, if it was an inhumation or a cremation, you can usually date kind of by that. What are general trends? There are some periods in prehistory where cremation is definitely the way to go. We find urn burials full of cremations. You then go to periods of inhumation. So you can track that just by style, orientation of the bones themselves, but also you're going to be looking for grave goods. Most people in the entirety of human history will be buried with goods, things that are important to them or things that the living want to send off with the deceased to whatever afterlife they may be hoping for. So we can also date based on the artifacts just as we would any other sort of dig.
Have you ever been on a dig where the what you are finding is showing conflicting different things where it's hard to put it all together?
Yes, there was definitely a dig that we did find some. A lot of this is still somewhat confidential. The report hasn't been typed up yet, but we did find a dig where it didn't make sense that we cut through a layer that we assumed was one time period, and it was very obviously a time period based on all of the artifacts we were finding and also the architecture. However, the burial that was not cut through but was actually buried underneath this layer should have post-dated. So it's very interesting that this specific type of, and then we're going basically on orientation because there were no grave goods, but based on the orientation, this period should have been much later than the layer right above it, which if you're going with the law of superposition, that states that as you're going down, the layers get older. So a layer above should be younger than the layer below. Well, in this case, what the burial was indicating was that it was actually younger than the layer above it.
And was that true, or is there something else going on?
It could just be a happenstance. Again, it was only 3 burials. It could easily have just been that these people were just placed and happened to in the process of being buried, happened to turn to a very specific orientation that we tend to go with a major religion. But it also could have just been that this tradition was actually seen earlier, and we haven't seen that yet in some of these burials.
Fascinating. And of all the digs you have done, what has been the most fascinating one you've worked on?
They're all really fascinating because they've all been very, very different time periods and very different peoples. So in Israel, we were digging outside of a mosque in Tiberias. This was working with the Hebrew University of Jerusalem. And this was, fascinating. We found some Roman stuff. We found a lot of tessera. Never want to dig another piece of tessera in my life. Tessera are the small squares that make up mosaics. So that was very interesting. Also, it was just very, very fascinating being in a land steeped in so much of history. That is really where it's the cradle of modern humankind, really. It's the Fertile Crescent. It's where agriculture is developing. There's so much even beyond the layers that we were digging. That's just fascinating. In Colorado, I was working with Crow Canyon Archaeological Center, so we were, doing a lot of the Pueblo people, ancestral Puebloan sites. So that is completely different time periods, different peoples, lots of different cultural aspects. Very similar geography, though. It's very deserty, very hot. So it's interesting to see how different people developed in areas that are not in contact. In Texas, that was actually my training dig, was a World War II POW camp where the Africa Corps, the Germans captured in Africa, were kept. Because, of course, the Geneva Convention mandates that you have to be kept in an area similar to where you were captured. So Texas is as close as America can get to Africa. And it was in July and August. I can attest to that. It was pretty miserable. So that was kind of fascinating, too, seeing, much later, much post-industrial modern site. And then in England is so fascinating. I did my studies there for a reason. It's because it is layer upon layer upon layer of habitation and utilizing the same kind of space very, very differently as you build upon it.
And through all your studies, have you specialized in one certain aspect of the past?
My undergrad at Mercyhurst College, now Mercyhurst University in Erie, Pennsylvania, was focused on funerary archaeology. That's what I did my thesis on. And that was still something that I keep up with today. Funerary archaeology is just fascinating, especially because the pageantry involved, or the development even of the modern funerary industry, which it is an industry. It's a lot of interesting developments of commercializing on and capitalizing on people's grief, because funerals are for the living, celebrations of the dead are for the living, and it's one to remind us of our own mortality, also to celebrate a life that has passed, but it is also our human nature, the way we deal with loss. So it's really fascinating how these have evolved, and the fact that it's always continuing. We're finding new information. The fact that Neanderthals buried their dead, they buried them with grave goods, they buried them specifically with pomp and circumstance, and the fact that that's developed in recent years, that we understand that as well. Further grave goods that have come up even earlier, that there is this, doesn't matter how supposedly advanced, how modern humans ever get, this is something that is intrinsic to us as a developing species and carries through into the modern world.
And I'm always curious, when you find a body on a dig, how is that treated?
It's going to depend on what culture you're digging in. If you are anywhere where it may be a still extant group, for example, if you are dealing with a site that may have contact with Indian groups, or that Indian groups may have lived there, then that is where NAGPRA comes into play, the Native American Grave Protection and Repatriation Act. That is, you stop digging immediately, you have to call in the state experts, and you get a lot more attention and press, but also because you want these bones to be respected. You want this person, this former person, to be respected and treated as a member of the culture they belong to. So if you're in America, you do stop and call in the experts, get them to try to figure out who this person may have been, who this person may have belonged to, what tribal or affiliation may exist still today. And then the overarching goal, is to repatriate those remains to the people that they came from.
And what about, say, if you're in England?
If you're in England, it's a different story. Now, largely because England is an entire island of invasions. You've got multiple ways of invasions. You've got multiple cultural blending, multiple genetic blendings. You're very much not going to find anyone that's purely descended from even some of the youngest burials. There's been so much gene drift, you can't trace it that way. So it's going to be, it's not as complicated per se. Yes, you still treat the remains with respect. Yes, you still try to understand who they are, where they came from. And that's actually where, in England, isotope analysis becomes very, very critical. Isotope analysis is when you can actually take a small portion of the bone and break down the isotopes and understand, well, where did these people come from based on what kind of water were they drinking? Was it fluoridated in a certain way? Did it have certain minerals that grew into their bones as they were a child? And then you can track that based on a lot of the, basically just going off of other studies that have been done in other areas as to where are these minerals found? Where do we match that this type of growth structure and periods of famine, we can also track that. So the bones tell a big story, and that's how you're actually going to track where these people came from. But to respect as to what happens to the bones, it's more often that they become an object of study, unless you can tell that they are a very specific person. For example, if you do find an enslaved person, you're going to treat that differently than you would, say, a Bronze Age burial.
Context also plays a major, major role. Again, context is the surroundings. It's what is going on. Is this burial in a mound? Is this burial near a structure, a former structure? Is this burial intercut, dug into? So it is a more recent burial than the structures around it. All of this is very, very critical. So, for example, when you find, say, Richard III in a car park, you're going to be able to understand that this is a very much earlier burial. It has nothing to do with the car park, but you can tell that with various methodologies, the law of superposition. So that is where the continuous building and habitation of the exact same spot gets very interesting and very delicate work, because these layers might not be that thick. These layers might be very, very quick of burning, rebuilding, tearing down, restructuring, reforming, so on and so forth, just because such a dense population in very, very small geographic area comparatively, in a very confined space with multiple layers of habitation happening very quickly.
Okay, and my last one, going on the same theme, is it different in Israel?
In Israel, you've got, again, any remains have to contact the Israeli Antiquities Authority. Pretty much anytime you find remains, you do have to identify it to any authority that might be there, any sort of state authority. And that then is just, yes, we found bones, yes, we found remains. There was a person who was buried here, let's treat this with respect, but let's also try to find, is this in context with whatever else we're digging as well? So, because the bones are telling us a big, big story. For example, if you are in a Bronze Age barrow, you know it's a burial mound. You know there are remains there. So that's kind of indicated ahead in the planning. It's expected. It's the unexpected remains that you have to deal with very carefully.
Also, just to verify that this was not any sort of recent or modern or cold case of any sort of foul play, because from pop culture, we do know that that does happen, and that can happen. There's this great story about the first initial bog bodies that were found in Ireland, that the body was so well preserved due to the anaerobic environment of the peat bog that the locals assumed that it had been a recent murder. And then it was found out, no, this was actually nearly a millennia older. But that is also a concern as well of notifying local authorities and clearing the remains of any sort of modern or more recent foul play.
And has DNA, especially since they've seemed to figure out how to study ancient DNA, changed archaeology in any way?
Not in the actual practice thereof. The methodology doesn't really change because you're still excavating the same ways. It becomes more important when you get into the post-excavation analysis, because that then you can find living descendants of some people based on some of this DNA research. We have got huge DNA resource centers through 23andMe, Ancestry, all of these. Oh, let's find out where our ancestry came from. We now have research access to some of these databases and can find living descendants or living, even distant living relatives of people in the past, which is really, really interesting, especially because then you can see the path of migration. You can actually know for certain that, yes, I had an ancestor here.
This question is, how different is it being an archaeologist than being a historian?
This is where you get into a little bit of interdisciplinary rivalry. Historians tended to, in the past, to discount archaeology because historians already had primary resources. They already had sources written by someone who was at an event and observing. So why did we need to find the actual artifacts? Archaeology, on the other hand, acknowledges the fact that people lie. People exaggerate. People want to leave a different record than what happened because they want to clear their own conscience. So sometimes every time you have to take primary resources with a grain of salt, because memory is faulty. If people are writing a couple days later, if they're writing about events hundreds of years earlier but were passed down by legend, these things are going to change the story. Archaeology can dovetail quite nicely with history, but also correct the historical record. For example, a battlefield. Finding a bullet in a place where no record of a person was is very indicative of, well, something different is here. And that's also, again, where bones come in, because sometimes you find burials in places you didn't expect to find people. So it should dovetail quite nicely. Each should inform the other.
All right. And now, one of the reasons why we are doing this podcast is I know you are very concerned about the state of archaeology going into the future. So can you talk a little bit about that?
Yes. Unfortunately, my alma mater, the University of Sheffield Executive Board, has had their motion carried to actually close the archaeology department, which is an increasingly disturbing trend in England of universities shutting the departments for archaeology and possibly shunting some of what is called the more valuable or more critical regions or aspects of the discipline into other departments. One, there's been no plan for this. Two, it's very arbitrary. And three, it's very much following the political trends of that we don't need heritage. We should look forward. We should build more. We should do more. We should not look to the past. And the fact that the universities, bastions of knowledge and what should be defenders of their students, are kowtowing to this political movement is extraordinarily distressing. The overarching reason given is that we're having fewer and fewer students. Archaeology is not a viable career. There aren't any jobs. Well, that's incredibly untrue, especially in England. CRM, the archaeology for doing some of this mitigation, doing any sort of commercial archaeology, is one of the disciplines that is incredibly short-staffed. It's always understaffed. There are jobs always available. So that reason doesn't really fly. It's very disturbing that we are shutting down departments and losing knowledge. The department archaeology at the University of Sheffield was one of the top universities, if not in research, in international relations. There are resources there that scholars from around the world would come to study, would come to actually engage with, thereby actually firming up some international relations. And the fact that this is no longer going to be available is hamstringing archaeology as a whole across the world. So the concerning conservative trend of underfunding and undercutting the humanities as less valuable than hard science is going to have an impact around the world, which is going to be devastating for our understanding of human history.
Yeah, that is very concerning. Is it similar in the United States?
Unfortunately, we've seen the same trends. There's a rise of conservatism. There's a rise of, well, we don't need to fund the humanities. Let's not give elementary schools money for music, for anything that's not sports and science. And that's a trend that is continuing and is now being echoed in higher education.
It is very, very disturbing, because the key fact is, if you build a road, you destroy everything underneath that road.
And even if, so let's take the Stonehenge tunnel, for example. Fortunately on pause, hopefully cooler heads will prevail there. However, the problem of, okay, yes, we're not going to disturb the view of Stonehenge, we're not disturbing where Stonehenge is, but Stonehenge is not in isolation. Nothing in archaeology is in isolation. There is historical context everywhere. You have to actually understand the entire geographic setting and understand why something was built or something was placed in a specific location within the wider context. And destroying a wider context just by going around a monument doesn't mean you're preserving that context. Vast amounts of information could be lost, particularly by digging that tunnel as close to the monument as it is. Again, archaeology is a study of the layers of human past, both metaphorically and physically, and going under the ground, under the current roadbed, far below where anything has been dug in modern times, we're going to lose a lot of that context if the mitigation archaeology isn't done, and isn't done well.
And the last thing, get into it, a lot of times on these digs, by preserving and looking and understanding the past, you actually are being very destructive when you're doing that.
Archaeology is a destructive discipline, yes. Once you have made the decision to excavate, you will never be able to place that object back in its context. That's why it's very important to be trained very clearly in recordation, in taking clear photographs, noting every aspect of the soil content, just in general, being able to go back to your notes and placing an object within relation to every single other piece of the puzzle.
Which gets back to the point where we need to train archaeologists, and we need to train them very well.
Exactly. And unfortunately, with a lot of the economic issues, with a lot of the pandemic issues, some of the older generation is not going to be coming back necessarily, because it's been proven that it's not going to be a viable career path with all of this political undercutting. And unfortunately, that's a lot of knowledge that's being lost training new diggers, especially for those who decide to go the commercial route instead of going the academic route initially.
All right. Well, thank you. And I guess what we're trying to encourage everyone is study archaeology. We need to figure out the past.
There's also the fact that even if you don't want to pursue archaeology in general, everyone should take at least one archaeology class to understand exactly why it is important to study the material remains of the past, or take an anthropology class at least to understand that, yes, people are different all over the world. Here is why cultures form differently. Here is the fact that people are still people no matter their cultural expression. There's also the physical anthropology side of understanding how humankind came to be in and of itself.
All right. Well, thank you, Rachel.
Thank you, Alex, for springing this topic on me today. And if you're interested in archaeology, especially how archaeology impacts what we do here at the Frontier Culture Museum, be sure to check out our celebration of International Archaeology Day, which is always the third Saturday in October. Coming up in 2022, it is October 15th, so be sure to check out our website and our Facebook page for more information about activities happening that day.
And if you enjoyed this podcast, please consider visiting the museum. We are open year-round and can always be found doing interesting things on site. Be sure to check out past episodes of this podcast for more historical topics. Thank you.